inside of me. Love remains a drug that's the high and not the pill. But did you know that when it snows, my eyes become large and the light that you shine can't be seen? Baby, I compare you to a kiss from a rose on the grave. Ooh, the more I get of you, stranger it feels.
Hey, great to see you again, Layman.
You too, my friend.
Hey, Robert, how are you doing?
I'm ecstatic and full of life.
That's good.
So I wanted to do a Valentine's Day love podcast talk on poetry and goodness, and so I would love to like talk about how the poetic isn't just like trivial epiphenomenon and how it can shape our reality and stuff.
Sure, sure.
Great. So I wanted to read a poem first. It's called Existential Feelings Arise at Some Crossroads. When I am with you too, it is like my ship has moored at a safe harbor in a tiny coastal city. My enemies now fooled or vanquished, all hurry subsides. In me other colors rise like jovial spirits at a noontime renewal, and I am harmonious once more. Despite the scholars and the financiers' motions and commotions, these encounters shape the daylight of my inner soul.
Oh, that was lovely.
So,
Yeah, touching.
so I guess for a little structure, maybe either of you really, first, could we share like a moment, maybe going around a couple times of just like a time you wrote a poem and it mattered, or someone gave you a poem, or how something like art or poetry like affected you? And maybe start with John.
Okay. So two, I'll three uh, things. The first is when I read Rilke's poem, The Archaic Bust of Apollo, and I got to the last line of "You must change your life." That was where I, I don't know if I would have named it that at the time, but that was my first really reflectively aware encounter with ontonormativity, with just the right that this you must change your life. Like the beauty just calls you, and the voluntary necessity of that calling, and that has all. And of course, I love all of Rilke, but that has really profoundly stuck with me. Um, and then another instance is when I read Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach, and especially I got to the last line, the army, ignorant armies clash by night. Um, that was where somebody had used poetry to absolutely crystallize the horror of the meaning crisis for me, and that landed very deeply. Um, and then not one, but all the times I've written Sarah poems, because I write her poems about it. Well, I write her a poem about every 2 weeks or so. I'd send it to her, and the way it allows me to convey things to her that nothing else I do, except maybe actions, convey to her how much I love her and how deeply she responds to it. She's somebody very attuned because of her musical gifts and her. I mean, one of the reasons she became a dentist is because it integrated artistry and therapy and engineering together, and so she's deeply responsive and receptive to the poetry I write her. And so it's interesting because for me, the poems with Sarah, I once asked her, I said, uh, would you mind if I like publish these? Because I think they're some of my best poems. And she said, I want to think about it. She came back and said, not till you're dead. Not till you're dead. I said, okay. Because for her, and this has now become a part of the aesthetics of the poem for poetry for me. Um, the poem carries on. It comes out of and is carried back into our relationship. And so, I mean, if I were just to say this, it would sound like a friggin' Hallmark card, but our whole relationship has become more poetical in a way that, Scott Walker would talk about. Um, uh, you know, and that has been really profound for me.
Perfect. That's great. Yeah, but that was I think you hit all the levels. If an angel would have shared a poem with you and you talked about that, then it might have been like the complete circlet or something. No, that's great. Layman, please, any kind of
Hmm.
similar things.
I was obsessed as a boy with limericks and with Lewis Carroll and with a kind of poetic language that exceeded logic into joy. You get a little older, you think, well, maybe that's a little bit clumsy and childish, but that underlying drive was still there. I think the poet I most fell in love with probably was Yeats, like with a lot of
Yeah.
people. I remember there was a science fiction miniseries produced by Oliver Stone, and it featured a repetition of this phrase from Yeats. The wind is old and still at play, but I must hurry upon my way, for I am running to paradise. In
Mm.
the sense that there's something kind of cautionary about it too, but also something deeply relatable. Like the forces of the world are here, but there's this other force moving you across those forces into some other transfiguration. I wrote a lot of poetry as an adolescent. In my 20s, I lived in a house where we had a poetry night once a week. And I'd just write and write and write all these poems, always experimental, some just rhythmic. I love Dada sound poetry and deconstructing language and all that kind of stuff. But I had a weird moment where I started to ask myself, like, what do I really love poetry? And I thought, well, I really love some poets. Then I thought, do I really love all of their poems? I really love some of their poems. And then do I really love the whole poem? I really love a couple of lines. And I thought, well, statistically, if I really love a couple of lines by a couple of poets, on average, you could say I don't like poetry, but I love those ones so much it makes up for the rest. But there something happened to me in that consideration where I didn't write poetry for years after that, and only came back to it through some of the more explicitly non-dual poets, through Hafiz and through the poetry of Zen koan language. That offered me mm, a way of feeling myself into a different articulation of changes that had gone on in me. I thought, oh, this is a language. This is a way of communicating my heart that also puts me into a great continuum or lineage with people who have tried this before, where you feel like you're overflowing with something that exceeds the constraints that are baked into ordinary language, which then put me back in touch with the simple joy of Lewis Carroll or paradoxical poetry play. I've always found that there's a sense of my feeling space, right, of a coherence that is my heart that is bigger than myself, and it has a sort of uh, filigree or very delicate infrastructure to it, and it's too delicate to be grasped with the logic of an ordinary sentence. I have to break up the pieces of a sentence in order to rearrange them in a way that conforms to the very delicate lines of
Mm.
architecture that seem to uh, describe what my heart is actually made of. So there's a lot of things I can only say by fracturing language and realigning it along these invisible tracks.
Yeah, I love how you're enacting the thing that we're talking about and just the gesture and the delicate use of language that you're like almost being more careful and caring as you were speaking. And yeah, that's lovely. I've always loved both poetry and like Aristotle, if he's the opposite end of poetry. Um, and Yeah, I was telling my this friend yesterday how lucky I was to be adopted by people that were very working class and I think like very not seeking PhDs and masters and positions of managerial leadership that's very technical. But they encouraged me to be creative. They would buy me books that they wouldn't read, but they knew I was excited for and stuff like that. And a lot of families like you want to fit the mold, and I saw that in other kids where they'd go, "Oh, you're gonna do like us, and when you leave that, we like punish you and put you back in the box we want you in." So I would feel very like lucky to be so different from my adopted family, but like very encouraged to be weird or myself or whatever. And yeah, I loved. I mean, I don't know. I've been reading since I could read, and loved even like I love wisdom poetry too. Just to bring a little bit of that. And you talked about Yeats and this kind of um, more than and subtle architecture of the cosmos and stuff like that. And it's um, like the Tao Te Ching I read as many times as I could check out, and there was one version that I think was just super poetic and flowy, and also very, I think, true to the text. That the um, and Emerson, I've had this book for like 30 years. Every essay opens with a little poem, and the poems are as beautiful as the essays, and the essays are, 15 or 20 pages, and the poem's like 4 lines, and it's um, I was thinking too, just kind of on my walk from my car up here, that like the kind of fourfold alchemy is constraining and shaping and has a kind of poetic function of like expressing things in different modes, but that can work together and that let you see different things. And I thought that that was kind of when you're just analyzing and top down and labeling parts, it's not as robust a lot of times as looking at these different poetic um, ways and stuff like that. And yeah, I loved just like writing poems for my mom on Mother's Day or my grandmother or people like that. And just like having them appreciate that. It's that other half of it that like with karma, you're not supposed to care about the outcomes of your good actions, but like it really feels good to have a poem appreciated or have a piece of art you made actually someone say like, "Oh, I see what you're doing there," or "Oh, that's really nice." So even being a good listener to poets is maybe something that could be a skill to be cultivated or something to be mindful of and stuff like that. Cool. So then I don't know if either of you would like to maybe just for 5 or 10 minutes teach about writing or poetry or just kind of share some thoughts on, that mode and how to connect to it or use it but not abuse it.
Well, I mean, for me, and this goes when I was teaching poetry writing. Um, what I did is I would have the kids keep a diary of the metaphors that they're spontaneously using without realizing throughout the day, and the gestures that they're using throughout the day, the natural poetry, and just note that for quite a while, then note it in other people, and then it was interesting how that often readily got them into a poetic stance, and that is carried on into my own work. I think that one of the deep implications of relevance realization and predictive processing is the pervasiveness of the imaginal, that most of our experience isn't direct detection, but it is vectored through not an image we're looking at, but the images are adverbial. It's the way in which we are looking at things, like, and then that shows up in conceptual metaphor. It shows up in conceptual metaphor. All of those words are that's poetic. And what I did with my hand, when I did that, that's poetry. And we know that gesture and conceptual metaphor are not ornamentations. The imaginal is a proper vehicle or cognition. We use it in fictive language. The road runs all the way up the mountain. Roads don't move at all. They're the things that move, that upon which things move. Uh, but and then, of course, that imaginal is integral to you being rational. The space inside your head where you do metacognition that is needed for reason, That space is an imaginal space. It's not literal, but it's not just an illusion because it gives you real knowledge about what you're really thinking so that you can really be rational. And your relationship to your future self is imaginal, and it's enhanced the more imaginal it is. And your inner life is dialogical, and you dream, and you have to dream in order to learn. These are like, so this is part of the philosophy of imagination as the imaginal, as the poetry that is integral, absolutely indispensably irremovable from reason itself and from perception itself, the two things that we think are our primary access modes to reality. So for me, and Douglas Headley's work has been deeply influential on this too, right? The iconic imagination. Yes, there you
That's his
go.
first book. Yeah, I think
Yeah,
you were
yeah.
talking about his third one or a second one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the one I used in realizing the imaginal. I think one of the great forgettings of our civilization and the way in which we become servile to propositional tyranny is that our diminishment of poetry and our failure to recognize about how integral it actually is to the very guts of our cognition, our communication, and our sense of having a shared world, a community. This is why I'm going to be talking to Scott Walker soon. All the work he does, on his channel. He left Scott, I can't remember. Were you at Harvard or Princeton? I think you were at Harvard. He left Harvard to go online and teach poetry uh, and bring back what he's especially interested in is bringing back the spirituality of poetry, and that's what I'm talking about here. Spirituality isn't about having wonderful experiences. It's about the kinds of exercises and practices that educate your connectedness, and the imagination is a primary way in which that is undertaken. So for me, this has become central to all of my work, the imagination in the imaginal sense. And poetry is the art form that does us anamnesis, the deep Platonic remembering of our humanity, not our autobiography, but about how much we are in and through and because of the imaginal. So that's what I would like to say. But where how it has become a central place in my work. And so it's odd that something that I used to have over here as part of, my romantic life is now also at the heart of my cognitive science.
I like that Socrates was erotic and full of life, and uh, there's no like written philosophy of Plato, but like Plato uses images, and he definitely assumed that the readers of his dialogues had a rich cultural grasp of a lot of like metaphors and
And he
imagistic.
invents a lot of metaphors. He
And
invents,
yeah, and he's like playing with them too. So they're not these static forms. He's reshaping and reimagining the Greek imaginal as he works. Yeah, and I love in this book too that he's not just saying like uh live in these fantasies. He talks a lot about self-awareness and like
yes.
how it's this they're both lost when we discard kind of romanticism, that the self-awareness and the mythopoetic kind of story nature that is not analytical enough for Galileo and his followers or whatever. Even though I don't know if Galileo hated poetry or anything. It's very weird how we got to where we are. Not to get too off topic.
Well, I mean, Calvinism explicitly had a lot to do with it. Calvin was very hostile to the imagination. It's a factory. What is it? A permanent factory for the production of idols. A very hostile attitude. And the removing of sacraments. And Douglas Headley makes this argument that
Yeah.
was an attack on the imaginal, a significant attack, and the denuding of the church of imagery. Um, I don't like to always blame the Protestants because I've got a reputation for doing that, but I that was a significant thing, um, and um, I I've learned from Douglas and others, but especially Douglas, that well, it's self-correction. I used to be sort of comprehensively critical of the Romantics because I didn't like the elevation of the imagination without proper regards to the propensity for self-deception. I still think that criticism has weight, but I've learned to counterbalance it with a more proper appreciation of how they were concerned with enhancing access to reality. And I think they were hoping, maybe it was a misplaced hope, but I think they were hoping that the enhanced access to reality would act as the corrective on self-deception. So I've come around a little bit. So now I reserve my criticisms and I explicitly always use the adjective for what I call decadent romanticism. And we do have decadent romanticism. Our romantic comedies are one of the great banes of Western civilization are decadent romanticism in the way that I'm very critical of. Yeah,
On
I should stop
Valentine's Day, if
talking.
I see anyone smiling leaving a theater, I'm gonna just throw this book at them. Just hit them with living forms of the imagination.
I mean, they're especially dangerous in our time because I was just talking to one of my grad students about this. The fact that more and more people are willing to go back into the Matrix or Nozick's experience machine, and they don't care that it's not real because social media has so blurred the distinction. And I think about great movies like Sunset Boulevard, where as a kid, I got, whoa, that when the line between reality and illusion blurs, people get really, they're damned. Like they spiral into a kind of hell. Um, and so I'm worried that as we denude the sense of the proper difference between illusion and the real, and thereby lose the liminal space of the imaginal, that romantic comedies will get more and more pernicious because we're conditioning people to believe that the universe should be comported to their narratives, which I really worry about. Because social media, especially with LLMs, can just feed that wish fulfillment, that fantasy in the pejorative sense, that fantastical way of thinking. I'm talking too much. I want to hear from Layman.
No, that's great. And Layman, please talk just as much or more. And I think that's wonderful.
For Valentine's Day, three dudes denounce romantic comedies.
Can I say something to you? Oh, that was really scary.
No. I love romantic comedies. I think they're great. I think like we have a lot of parts and a lot of we're these multi-goal systems trying to accomplish a lot of things at a lot of times. I really like John Russin's kind of conception of like everyone you see has these relationships that are backgrounded that you don't see, and so there's so much kind of suchness and moreness happening that and yeah, it is. Really easy to accidentally become kind of trapped in a narcissistic nightmare where you're just being controlled to turn into a consumer by the algorithms, and they're happy to have you just spend all your time in this non-space, having non-relationships that please your ego or feel like you're accomplishing something, and then all of a sudden you're just shown an ad and it really constrains what it is to be a person. And then you take the opposite, right? And then like the charioteer in Plato or in Ezekiel, and you go, holy crap, all that's happening in every little body or whatever. Like, so I think you don't want to be this Gnostic or like a pawn in some kind of political, cultural system or whatever where you're being taken. And then there's this, sweet spot. And that's why I think images, can strike us. They need to be able to be ridiculous to actually like pull us towards them. And part of their weirdness is their power. And so, when you have a mystical experience that's maybe an image or something like that, you go, what? That's nothing like what I've been thinking about for the last, X amount of time. But, that's a part maybe of oneself trying to grab your conscious attention. And it maybe speaks in its own language too. I think our friend Anderson Todd is a great interpreter of dreams, and that's tricky. It's so easy to be like, oh, It's that when maybe it was these other things, and so yeah, I think is rich in what you said, and now I definitely want to hear Layman.
All right, if I was teaching a mini course on poetics, what would I include? Maybe four or five things that are of interest to me. One is the misheard, or maybe the transversal of language, something like that. I heard Deleuze once say, style in language is to cause your language to stutter. And it like opens it up to the discovery of a new dialect of your own within it. There's something about the fragmentation or the mishearing or the distortion of the surface layer of language that can open it up to poetic juxtapositions. And I've often found that this comes to me through um, misheard phrases and framings, right? There's been so many songs where for years I misheard it and thought it was just lovely. And then it turned out that wasn't in the song, that was in me. That was a piece of my poetic architecture. I remember I insisted that a Talking Head song contained the line "Get closer to this far away," and years went by until I discovered that line is not in that song, and it not only strikes me as poetic, but as particularly distinct to me, and also to the philosophical architectures that I've laid out, all embedded in that. So I think if people are looking for their poetic voice, one great place to look is where they discover they've been rearranging, mishandling, or distorting the
Ah,
surface layer
yeah,
of language.
that's cool.
Another
That's good.
another element that stands out is my response to how I was taught about poetry in school, which was sort of the tail end of modernity in a sense. I remember teachers telling me that poetry was to, craft an evocative image with as few words as possible. And I thought, oh, they're overly influenced by Hemingway or by the spirit of the typewriter or something. And we've
Yeah.
lost this beautiful 17th century sense that language can expand and gallop and have richness. And more important than the richness, the structure, right? I think there's something in. I started to really love writing sonnets for a long time, and in the particular constraint of the architecture and in the notion of the rhythmic elements, and the intonations and the subtle consonances and alliterations, understanding that, looking for that in language, and then trying to reproduce yourself with those structures, I think that opens a stairway to spiritualization in language that isn't available to you if you don't see those tactical moves.
Mm.
You can't make that staircase unless you have the staircase building elements at your disposal. So I think it is important to uh, get a visceral sense of how you want to handle those things, but really explore and fall in love with that old sense of poetics. Another thing that comes up for me, I have this whole spiel around mythocolloquialism and this tendency we have to separate our sense of the simple non-spiritualized, non-enchanted language and other exotic people in distant lands or the past who had the enchantment. And I think that split has to be healed. And partly healing it involves understanding that they were speaking their everyday language. They
Mhm,
were
mhm.
giving more to it than we give. But I think we have to heal our language and stop imagining that the real sacred poetry lives in Pali and Sanskrit and not in 21st century English, right? They had a way of hearing even the generic terms of their own language with a poetic reverberation. Like we speak of love and art and earth and war, but it seems to us that it doesn't strike us poetically the way it struck them when they were speaking of their gods and goddesses. But I think that's a skill we can learn if we attune ourselves to it. Like we can ask ourselves and even our bodies to be more poetically responsive to everyday words and phrases, right? And really let them reverberate in us to find their poetic charge and our ability to speak into that language. I think Heidegger's interesting in this respect, right? Heidegger does a lot of thinking about how we've been maybe trapped in technical attunement and we need to shift to a poetic mode. And you can critique that. Badiou does a great job of critiquing why Heidegger's notion of the poetic should be expanded to include mathematics and set theory and all this stuff. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. There are ranges of poetics that we don't experience as poetic, and we can give ourselves permission to do that. I heard a guy on the CBC one time say that he became a poet because he lacked the imagination for mathematics. Right. So there is a sense in which mathematics and poesis can be generalized and expanded to domains you don't normally associate it with. And I think that's true even at the perceptual level. Like Schopenhauer spends so much time trying to think out how intentional aesthetic contemplation can temporarily remove you from the agonizing eternity of the blind will. But there is something beautiful in that, the choice to undergo a contemplative moment that turns something you didn't think of as poetic into something that really shines forth in its aesthetic totality, partly because of what you're bracketing out of that moment. I think that's a poesis contemplative practice that's available that can convert things into poetry. And then the only other thing I would throw in here is the notion of superlatives, especially when we're talking about love. And our rational architecture, like John was talking about, it's so easy to be deluded. And we do have to be cautious, especially in spiritual and philosophical discussion. Somebody starts talking about totalities and infinities. You're like, whoa, maybe it's a lot, but is it infinite? Right? We want to like put some constraints on the intensity that's being evoked by people's language when we're doing analysis. But we also have to be capable of maximal signification, let's say, right? Of doing what the names of God are supposed to do, right? The most high, the most glorious, the most merciful, the all loving, the supremely compassionate. There's a sense of like pitching ourselves into an attunement that maxes out our capacity for adoration of something, God or the world. Right. And I think that's something that we need to be capable of as minds and as bodies in order to do good love poetry and in order to do good religion. Right. We want to make sure we don't mistake that for a technical description of reality, but it is a capacity we need to practice by allowing ourselves to go to the most place in our speech, especially our affective speech, right? To say love right up to the maximum possibilities of saying.
Yeah, I love that because I think like in serious play, in like in effortful things, you use your means to reach an ends, but in play you flip that and you use
Yeah.
what you have as ends as means. And I really like the kind of uh, Voltaire notion of superfluity, and it's ridiculous. It is a kind of like divine madness or something like that, where you're but it's also the power of Gandalf of speaking something into being. You cannot pass. And by saying I love you, just shouting I love you across the courtyard to someone is the least scientific thing you could do, but it's also like awesome and really good. And it redeems sincerity and the organizational science on affect is just missing. And I've talked to, like, I asked people that study motivation and affect in the applied sciences, and it's like it's a ripe opportunity for research because there's like personality psychology and emotion psychology and positive psychology, but they kind of stay in their own field. And then bringing them into the kind of the existential, like what is the life well lived, and how do they balance and counterbalance the intellect or the will? How do they empower or limit the will? And those kind of reciprocal relationships between these things, and why would self-awareness matter and stuff like that? Like it really um, is interesting because training gives skills, but it also gives confidence. Even if someone learns nothing, they feel like they learned something. And then if they go do a job after they've trained, they'll be like, I was just trained. I'm going to be good at this. And so it also has these affective components. And, there's this awesome literature in skill decay, but there's like affective awareness decay too, that you can be a really self-aware person at one part of your life and then just calcify as you get into a relationship that grows stale or a role in your job that grows stale. And then like some Jungian therapy or a poetry club or I really like the idea of art therapy, how it both has psychological distance, so it creates safety, but it also that distance lets you see yourself in a different way too. So it's like both safe and revealing. And then if you can integrate that and like have it then, become part of your broader psyche, then it has this whole, dynamic that is really hard to do by just going, okay, let's lay out the problems and let's lay out the solution paths and you forget these. I mean, it's so easy to forget the kind of affective, imaginative part of the self when you're doing business or doing science or just being analytical or whatever. Um, so yeah, that was lovely. And I like the gesture, even just if you tie someone's hands or don't let them use their hands when they're expressing themselves, they like get anxious and express themselves kind of qualitatively worse. So it's even that is a form of singing things into being or dancing as a form of knowing the world and participation and stuff. And I think the just Neoplatonic or Owen Barfield kind of ideas of participation do get at this kind of like place before the subject object or above it or whatever that is really cool in what you were both saying.
There's, first of all, it's a great pleasure to listen to Layman. I think, I mean, Layman, everything you're saying is so beautiful, but your manner is exemplifying what we're talking about, in a way that I deeply just want to acknowledge and appreciate. Um, um, I like people.
I
I'm
like his eyes.
I'm attracted to people like Plotinus, where spiritual exercise, art, artistry, poetry, and argument are interwoven. And you tend to do that very naturally, Layman. So I just wanted to appreciate that. I think that's really, really wonderful. Um, Maybe there's a connection here. Well, the thing I wanted to say, and maybe it does connect to my recognition of Layman. Um, Like there's increasing work. Mithrin started it, but others around musolanguage, and it's being extended. The idea that uh, that music, language, gesture, all these sort of the homes of poiesis, actually had a common ancestry in human evolution. It helps to explain why we find it natural to put language and music together in song, or music and gesture together in dance, or to put song and dance together. Like I could imagine aliens that would find this the most bizarre thing in the world. Why are they putting language and music together? And yet we find it so deeply natural. And so, this is Winckelmann's idea that um, when the neuraxial integrate, when we reach into these more, I hope this word is more neutral, when we reach into more archaic levels of our processing, we're not only reaching back, we're reaching to a more common ground between us. It actually facilitates and improves communication. So the research that you get people to move in synchrony, their capacity to trust each other and to understand each other is improved. That's why doing Tai Chi with other people is a really important thing to do when you can do it. So I just wanted to bring out, I don't know quite how to say it, but there's something like there's a reaching back, a reaching down that also affords us reaching out to each other when we're engaged in poetry. We're tapping into, we're going into shared common ancestors of all of the different modes that modernity has liked to fragment. We get Kant's three critiques and we break them all off from each other, the true, good, and the beautiful. But when you do, brain scans, and all brain scans are problematic, but when you do them of people making normative judgments of truth or goodness or beauty, the brain isn't using massively different areas. It's just like, yeah, this is the good, this is the good, right? And um, so I wanted to also bring in that way in which poetry, by taking us back, can actually afford us getting beneath all of the divisions and dichotomies and boundaries and maybe even tribal allegiances, the specializations of modernity. And in that sense, it can restore us to our past and to each other, which I think is really, really important for human beings. We are the creatures whose pasts and whose relationship to each other in promises, history and promises are how we're different from other animals in a reliable way. So I just wanted to bring that out also as a way in which I think poetry is properly restorative, or Tolkien sense, Tolkien recovery of deeper aspects of our humanity because of the way it facilitates us. It gets us to remember our story and makes us able to share that story with each other. And I think that's really important.
It's super interesting the normative power of story that I didn't really appreciate for a long time. It's funny because I've watched like every sci-fi movie made from 1980 to 2010 or something like that. I just like I love fantasy worlds, and even being a graduate student is kind of like being on a foreign planet in a fantasy world that isn't reflective of most of reality. And I spent a lot of time in that domain, and I even like the Singing Neanderthal is a great book to read, and like
Yes.
babbling. I do babbling sometimes. I'll just take a word or a phrase and just try to use it as like a noun, indefinite noun, a verb, and just have 20 or 30 kind of forms of that. And at the end, I'm like, oh, that's so much richer than what I was first thinking. And so just kind of um, what can feel nonsensical from a very rational perspective can be very generative from an existential perspective. And like you said too, I think both of you, that it affords by constraining, and it leaves out, and what's left out is just as telling as what's kind of shown. And uh, that's a home, and it's homing in itself. It's a very profound thing to kind of go, oh, and especially when everyone is staring at it together, and it creates a shared kind of experience. Like we had, I don't know if you two, North Americans but not Americans, celebrate the Super Bowl, but that's like probably one of the most stared at moments of the American cultural year. And so people are just talking about kind of tragically the advertisements and the fetishized moments of the game and stuff like that. But it is embodying that collective um, moment, and then it does create communitas afterwards and little water cooler moments afterwards where people are, expressing themselves in what they choose to share and how they listen and stuff. So the the Geist, to be a little fancy, of what we're talking about is still present. It's just not as sacred as it used to be.
That's what I was looking for. There's a deep connection, but because poetry reaches back into that common ancestor, like it's Geist affording. It gets us cross-generational and it gets us communal. It gets us into the same, well, the same Geist. Um, yeah, that's what there's a Geist. There's a the poesis is Geist affording. Is how I would put it in a horrible sounding way. I mean, one of the things about one of the joys about German is you can do what you were talking about. You can babble a lot more in German, and it's
Mm,
grammatically tolerated. You got to
yeah.
bend and break rules in English a lot more. But in German, just turn that noun into a verb. Like, and just do that, right?
That is, I think, though, part of recovering it is like sometimes I'll just be waiting for something and I'll go like, oh, a genie must have, dropped an egg or something. And the people know, like even if it's some very like, commercial moment, they get when or I love saying to students, I don't know if I'm going to hell for this, but I'll say when I'll ask them like, did you do any homework since the last time I saw you? And then like, it's mostly no. And I'll go, oh, an angel. You can't see it, but I think an angel just fell out of the sky and feels pain right now. And it's a creative way to kind of remind them that it's good to study. And I don't want to just lecture and finger wag and go like, well, now you're a loser. Like, so saying something that's a little bit kind of
I, I had a
creative.
I had a professor like that, and he did a lot of work about the logical bringing logical rigor into psychology and especially into theoretical psychology. And his examples of he would always use this thing, you know, of weird statements was, for example, whenever I say Edmonton, somewhere an elf is chopped cleanly in two, and he would use that like all, and it became a trope associated with him. And now I can't hear the word Edmonton without thinking about an elf breaking cleanly in two. Yeah.
Right, as a memory aid, they're so profound. They're just as
Well,
profound as
but I
place.
think
Yeah.
that's what I'm talking about. I'm thinking about the reaching back that's also a connecting. It has a tremendous mnemonic value to it. So it's Geisterforning and mnemonically pertinent. Yes. Which is why we
Yeah, there's
store
something
civilizations in poems, right?
I think a lot about the um, splicing together or intermixing of different sense making systems. And there's something
Yeah,
about,
yeah,
you find a spot between two spots and it pulls in both directions. And then you're also in that moment opening up to a form that might more strongly represent a common ancestor, something shared by both of
yeah,
those elements.
yeah, yeah,
And then
yeah.
it returns you to that archaic capacity to bring the Geist forward. There was a couple other things that came up for me. Rob, when you mentioned Gandalf, I'm vaguely aware that Gandalf was partly by Tolkien based on the Finnish sorcerer Venamoinen. And I had this book on wizards and witches when I was a kid, had this great painting of Venamoinen, and the caption said he was singing the beings into existence.
Oh,
And now I live among Finns, and we were out camping a few years ago, and I was on a rock and I was holding a stick of wood to help me walk. And I'm like, oh, I'm like Vanamoinen. Here I am among the Finns, and I've got my staff. So I thought, oh, I'll sing the beings into existence. And I looked out across the lake, and all the beings were already there. I'm
The road goes ever on and on, down from the door which began. Now far ahead the road is gone, and I must follow it if I can.
like, oh. So I tried to like chant and invoke them anyway. And I thought, oh, maybe he's not singing them into existence as if out of nothing. He's singing the being of beings into
yeah,
existence,
yeah.
right? I'm evoking my ability to encounter their beingness with this act, this poetic enchantment act. So that's one piece. The other one is a guy who was really important to me around a lot of this stuff, Genlin. Sometimes people say Genlin.
Yeah,
His work on trying to find this proprioceptive felt fit between how your whole system is
yeah,
encountering a subtle quality and how you might be able to novelly language that in a moment. To me, is sort of the epitome of experimentally bringing two sense making systems together and
yeah,
actually working on it until you feel that click. And I use that a lot of the time with practices that are vaguely like omen reading or something. You're like, you see a raven do a weird thing and you're like, aha, gives you a feel. You're like, this is a thing that makes you go, hmm.
Things that make you go,
It's got some little extra meaningfulness charge to it. And then you start to produce possible meaning structures, words, symbols, images. And you know, no, no, no. And then you're like, oh, the tide moving over tiny white stones. I don't know why, but that feels to me right now about the same as that feeling I got from that raven. I can't see the connection, but I can now hold them together because there's a resonant coupling, and I can then start to reason or language to see how they might fit together. And if I can find some logic that brings them together, it's like I suddenly get a glimpse into an image that represents something very archaic, but also hybridizes these two and brings my whole system into greater integration. But it also uh, evokes an imaginal aspect of my unique being. Like you come up with something that's really true to yourself. It's so weird. You've got no references for it. You've struggled to figure out why this odd reference and resonance is working. And it's like I feel like I'm fleshing out my actual imaginal body and not just populating it with things I've taken on from the culture. But it requires this actual proactive attempt to bring things into semantic connection that might not otherwise be connected.
it's really fascinating. I did work with John Kennedy and I forget Leo's name I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Buba Kiki effect.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So you have a figure that's made of all curves and another one that's spiky, and you ask people which one's Kiki and which one's Booba. The spiky one's Kiki, this one's Booba. Well, they did further research. You give people like square and circle, and the amount of consensus on like which one's happy, which one's sad, which one's male, which one's female, which one's spring, which one's winter is amazing. Like you get the like so I think this is also maybe goes back to the musal language thing, which is the way in which, without realizing it, we're all on a continuum of synesthesia. And we also know that mindfulness practices, this is Walsh's work, can bring out more, make people more synesthetic. And I
Huh.
think that goes to what you're saying, Layman. I think that the common ancestry is also showing up in this sort of synesthetic reservoir that we can recover. Um, and what you get is, and by the way, there's like, I've had, this is a story, this is a cool story. So I was studying synesthesia, and you get the usual ones, color, number, and stuff like that, and things like that. And I was teaching this young boy math, and there was something not working, like arithmetic. And then I got an inclination, and then I started questioning him. And then I've later found out that this is a bona fide documented case. He had a number personality synesthesia. Certain numbers had certain personalities, and certain numbers, numerals, couldn't go with each other because there would be a
Yeah.
personality conflict. And it was like, oh my goodness. Now, and so you can use that kind of interference to show that synesthesia is a real thing. But what you can also show is that synesthetes are augmented in many powerful ways. They can pick up on complex, multivariate patterns in ways we can't, precisely because they can engage a multimodal kind of ability. And Kandinsky did a lot about the spiritual and art, because he was terrifically synesthetic, and he was bringing that in. And so I just wanted to add that into what Layman was saying. I think we're much more synesthetic than we realize, and that is also something we can recover and tap into. I hadn't put all those together in my mind until this conversation.
Great.
The synesthetic, the imaginal, the common ancestry. So thank you. This has been uh, really wonderful. To me, they feel like they belong very well together. That's an instance of what I'm talking about. That intuition, which is synesthetic in nature, that things that have been typically siloed somehow belong together in a yet undisclosed fashion. That, to me, that's the synesthetic affordance. You're getting a sense of, oh, 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 yes. So I
I
just want
love when you see someone teaching or talking and they just start using analogies and metaphor and they're just like something clicked and they just had this kind of self-critical insight cascade and they just start speaking like, oh, that's like this and this is like that and and they just use I remember one time seeing this very esteemed kind of mathematical professor teaching like a multi-level modeling course and he just said like eight poetic kind of images in a row and I'm like, oh, while he was, doing this for us, he was like having new insights and they were just coming out not as like, here's my Aristotelian list, but as these little kind of analogies and analogical reasoning is so super abundant for crossing gaps that logical reasoning kind of fails to cross and it's there's limits. I took a really awesome training course. There's limits to using organizations are like computers, organizations are like living systems,
yeah.
organizations are like the brain, but they're incredibly rich, like symbols are. And you can have a few of Epictetus's stories or a few Christian parables or Zen koans, and they're so multi-apt to reality, and they're so ready to hand in a way that kind of frozen logical thinking is unable to deal with. So yeah, I love what you're saying.
I just before Layman says something, I had that experience yesterday.
Yeah, yeah.
I realized that I like the Bible in me more than I like reading the Bible. The
What
way
does that mean? Say that in a different way, maybe.
so I had the I because I was brought up read the Bible 7 or 8 times, multiple passages, had the stories told to me every Sunday, multiple times a week. The Bible has seeped into me and it comes out, like verses come out. And they seem very pronounced in what we're talking about, their ability to afford connection either with people or between domains that have been isolated from each other. We have all kinds of research from Golden Meadows and work in therapy that metaphors, that's what it does. In fact, some people argue, Mithrin does, that was the big breakthrough in the Upper Paleolithic transition. But if I take those passages and I go back and I read the section of the Bible that they're from, I'm not as impressed. Sorry, that sounds incredibly egocentric, and I don't mean it to be.
No,
I'm
I had
not.
that thought when I was reading the Bible. I'm like, I could have wrote this. Like,
No, I
which is a
don't.
ridiculous
I
thought.
I don't mean anything ridiculous like that. I
No, that
mean,
was what I said. That was
oh,
not
okay.
projected to you. Yeah.
No, I mean, a passage from Paul will come up, and it'll just seem how it touches the depths of things that no other speech could. But when I go back and read the passage that's from, I'm often seeing what Paul's doing, and I'm going, I don't buy this. I don't buy the argument. That's what I'm trying to talk about. I'm trying to talk about how it is in situ as opposed to how it is situated in me more archetypally. Like I prefer it that way. And I realize that can be very problematic. I mean, Melville's all about the Bible's doing that in him, but when he brings it up into awareness, it doesn't hang together with reality anymore. And he's like, right, and that's Moby Dick. But I know. I just wanted to share that story seemed to resonate with what you were just saying. I tend to like how it goes into me and comes out of me spontaneously than when I read it on the page. Now, for other things, that's not the case. Plato comes out of me like that, but when I turn back to Plato, Plato goes whoosh to me. And I can't tell the difference between them. It's probably just my temperament. I don't want to attribute the difference.
Well, the Greeks love rationality. I was trying to explain this to Sevilla, our friends' reading group. We're reading Plotinus right now, and they were a rational people. Like they got to have Egyptian irrationality, and they get to have Christian mythology and stuff like that. But like they have a love of logic and of inquiry that is very, very rare in history. And
A really beautiful, rich conversation. Happy Valentine's Day.
Happy Valentine's.
romantic
Bye.
for
Good to see you,
so
John.
long.